The U.S. House debated the reauthorization of Section 702 of the FISA Act. It gives the government authority to conduct surveillance on foreigners outside the U.S. Following the debate, the House voted 256 to 164 to approve the legislation. The current authority expires January 19th. The debate is just under an hour.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of S-139. On January 19th, the FISA Amendments Acts of 2008 will expire. This vital legislation includes Section 702, which permits the government to target foreign citizens located overseas to obtain foreign intelligence information. Section 702 is one of the most, if not the most, critical national security tool used by our intelligence community to obtain intelligence on foreign terrorists located overseas. Now, some claim Section 702 vacuums bulk information without due regard to the intended target. This assertion is simply false. 702 is a targeted program with roughly 106,000 foreign targets worldwide. Given that the worldwide population is about 7.5 billion, this program can hardly be described as bulk collection. Section 702 targets spies, terrorists, weapons proliferators, and other foreign adversaries who threaten the United States, and locating them is crucial to protecting our troops and our homeland. As an example, Haji Aman, who was the second in command of ISIS, was located via Section 702 and later removed from the battlefield. While the vast majority of examples remain classified, this is just one instance that demonstrates the necessity of this authority. Subject to multiple layers of oversight by all three branches of government, Section 702 is one of the government's most rigorously overseen foreign intelligence collection authorities. To date, while compliance incidents occur and are dealt with appropriately, there has never been a known intentional abuse of this authority. Nevertheless, the program should be subject to regular adjustments as necessary to ensure the effectiveness of privacy protections. Therefore, after careful consideration of the best way to strengthen privacy protections without hindering the program's effectiveness, the committee supports S-139, a bipartisan bill that includes provisions and addresses concerns raised by the House Judiciary Committee and the Senate. The bill's reforms include requiring specific Section 702 query procedures separate from existing minimization procedures, which must be reviewed by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court every year, limiting the instance in which the government can use Section 702 information to prosecute U.S. people, requiring the Inspector General of the Department of Justice to conduct a review of the FBI's interpretation and implementation of FBI's Section 702 query procedures, temporarily codifying the end of the NSA Section 702 upstream abouts collection until the government develops new procedures and briefs the Congressional Intelligence and Judiciary Committees. And finally, improving transparency by mandating the publication of Section 702 minimization procedures and requiring additional reporting to Congress on how the intelligence community is using other FISA authorities. During discussion over the past several months, both the House and Senate have made several concessions to achieve this compromise language in order to reauthorize this critical national security authority. Accordingly, S-139 now includes a probable cause-based order requirement for the FBI to access the content and Section 702 communication during FBI criminal investigations on Americans unrelated to national security. This order requirement does not reflect the committee's belief or intent that access to lawfully acquired information constitutes a separate search under the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment, as interpreted by numerous federal courts, does not require the FBI to obtain a separate order from the FISC to review lawfully acquired 702 information. Though not required by the Constitution, this compromise is meant to provide additional protections for U.S. information that is incidentally collected under Section 702. Along with the restrictions on the use of Section 702, information on criminal prosecutions, this should provide further assurances to the American public that this vital national security tool is used strictly to discover and mitigate foreign threats to the United States and the handling of use of any incidental U.S. person information is carefully controlled and monitored. Mr. Speaker, America faces an array of international threats, more complicated than anything we've endured in the past. Speaking as for the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, I cannot emphasize enough that now is not the time to draw back on key national security authorities. I am dismayed by the amount of disinformation being propagated by those who oppose Section 702 for purely ideological reasons. When Congress must reauthorize this program again in 2023, we hope those who debate these issues, both inside and outside this chamber, do so with intellectual honesty and integrity. The U.S. Rights Act, which has been offered as an amendment in the nature of substitute, is an attempt to kill this compromise. In its place, the amendment would begin resurrecting the information sharing walls between national security and law enforcement that the 9/11 Commission identified as a major factor in the failure to identify and thwart the 9/11 plot. If individuals in this body cannot learn from history, they are doomed to repeat it. There is no support for this bill in the majority of the committee's jurisdiction, whose members understand that this amendment would render Section 702 inoperable. Therefore, in order to keep the U.S. interests and troops abroad safe from harm, we must ensure that our intelligence community has the tools it needs to provide intelligence to our soldiers abroad. Section 702 is critical in that regard, and S-139 provides the intelligence community with the authorities needed to protect the homeland while implementing key privacy enhancements. I thank the Speaker. I urge passage of S-139 and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
As HPSC's ranking member and a former member of the Judiciary Committee, I've long advocated for reforms to surveillance authorities to balance the imperatives of national security and counterterrorism with the privacy rights and civil liberties of Americans. Today, the FISA Amendments Reauthorization Act seeks to reauthorize the program while making changes to protect privacy interests. Nonetheless, Mr. Chairman, as I indicated before we took up the bill, in light of the significant concerns that have been raised by members of our caucus and in light of the irresponsible and inherently contradictory messages coming out of the White House today, I would recommend that we withdraw consideration of the bill today to give us more time to address the privacy questions that have been raised, as well as to get a clear statement from the administration about their position on the bill. I do this reluctantly. Section 702, I think, is among the most important of all of our surveillance programs. Nonetheless, I think that the issues that have been raised will need more time to be resolved, and I think we need to get a clear statement from the administration of whether they're in support of this legislation or they're not. This morning, as my colleagues are aware, the President issued a statement via Twitter suggesting that this authority was used illegally by the Obama administration to surveil him. Of course, that is blatantly untrue, but nonetheless casts an additional cloud over the debate today. In light of these circumstances, I think the better course would be for us to defer consideration, give us more time to address the issues that have been raised by the privacy community within my own caucus, but also within the administration about its inaccurate, conflicting, and confusing statements on the morning of debate. So with that, I reluctantly urge my colleagues to postpone consideration so that we can take up this bill when it is more ripe for consideration, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Utah.
I would like to turn my time over to Chairman Conaway from Texas.
Is the gentleman yielding to the gentleman from Texas to control the time?
Yes, I'd like to yield him 5 minutes. Thank you.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank my colleague from Utah. While I'm not unappreciative of my colleague from California's comments, I do think we're at a place where we do need to move forward. If we succumb to the emotions of what's going on around us and don't stick to the facts, stick to the what we're trying to get done, and I think it's that we do that to our detriment. So I have great respect for my colleague and his opinions, but that I personally believe that plays into the emotions of what's going on rather than the facts of what's going on, and if we can just continue to push forward. First, let me say that the FISA Amendments Reauthorization Act is a bipartisan compromise bill that preserves the operational flexibility of Section 702 while instituting key reforms to further protect U.S. person privacy. One of the major issues discussed over the past year has been the NSA's Abouts Communication Collection. A tortured title, but nevertheless we'll stick with the phrase Abouts Communication. So Abouts Communications Collection takes place in NSA's upstream collection, and due to how the Internet communications work, allows NSA to collect the communications that may reference a Section 702 target email address. Despite what some of my colleagues may push in their propaganda, Abouts collection does not collect names of targets, just selectors. Some of my colleagues also suggest that Abouts communication is inherently in violation of the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. While the FISA court has raised concerns about Abouts communications collections in the past, NSA has been able to conduct such collection with the approval of the FISA court. This type of collection is at issue today because it was subject to a compliance incident in 2016. NSA self-reported a problem to the FISA court and decided to cease Abouts communication collection until a fix could be implemented and demonstrated to the court. I would like to note that this type of self-reporting of compliance incidences is expected of the intelligence community elements and proves that oversight mechanisms are in place and that they work. Other potential legislation, including the amendments to today's base bill, would seek to permanently end Abouts communication collection. This is short-sighted and a dangerous proposition that will limit the NSA's ability to identify threat networks in the future. Rather than ending Abouts communication collection, S-139 strikes, I believe, that right balance. If NSA wants to reestablish Abouts communication collection, NSA would first need to go back to court, convince the judge that it was satisfied the court's concerns. After achieving judicial approval that NSA has made the necessary technical changes, NSA would then brief congressional intelligence and judiciary committees on how they plan to reinstitute this type of collection. Barring congressional action, NSA can then start Abouts communication collection 30 days after those briefings. Some of our opponents to Section S-139 claim that 30 days is not enough. To the folks who claim that 30 days is not enough, there's nothing stopping Congress from acting after that 30-day window. However, NSA should not be penalized and America's security should not be compromised and prevented from obtaining valuable foreign intelligence information that the FISA court has deemed consistent with the Fourth Amendment just because Congress can't pass legislation in 30 days. This compromise of the bill that's on the floor today, I believe, is the right answer, and I hope my colleagues will support S-139, and I yield back my time to...
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Madam Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed S-875, an act to require the Comptroller General of the United States to conduct a study and submit a report on filing requirements under the Universal Service Fund programs, in which the concurrence of the House is requested.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Utah.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make Mr. Schiff aware that we have no further speakers and I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, once again, I would reluctantly urge that we withdraw consideration of the bill for today. I certainly have been working as hard, I think, as anyone to try to agree to a compromise that would move forward this very important surveillance authority, but would strike the right balance between our security interests and our privacy interests. But I do think we need more time to work on this bill, and I think that was only underscored this morning with the contradictory statements coming out of the administration. An issue of this magnitude and this seriousness really deserves serious and sober consideration. I think we need more time to discuss this with our members, and would urge my colleagues not to bring this to a vote today and to give us more time to work on it. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
He yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Utah.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close. Some of my colleagues believe that Congress should go above and beyond what is required by the Fourth Amendment and institute additional safeguards on how the government handles any potential U.S. person information that may be incidentally collected under Section 702. While the varying committees may have different ideas as to how to strike the right balance between additional privacy measures and national security, the art of the compromise brings us to the current junction. Under S-139, if the bill conducts a U.S. person query into its database during a criminal investigation not related to national security and conducts a Section 702 communication, the FBI must obtain an order from the FISA court prior to assessing the content of the communication. The committee does not believe that such an order is necessary under the Fourth Amendment, but it is adding more protections as a matter of policy in order to address unfounded concerns by opponents of Section 702 that the authority is being used to investigate U.S. people. Proponents of the U.S. Rights Act amendment will say that S-139 does not go far enough in its current form and that they have crafted a great compromise that allows the intelligence community to do its job. Unfortunately, they are selling a poison pill that is extraordinarily harmful to our national security. Per the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, under U.S. Rights Act amendment, the FBI would not be able to look at lawfully collected data related to suspicious activities similar to that of the 9/11 hijackers. This is unethical to the 9/11 Commission report, and anyone who thinks about voting for the U.S. Rights Act amendment should pick up a copy and skim it prior to voting. Unlike the U.S. Rights Act amendment, S-139 is able to balance national security and privacy while adhering to the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission reporting. I echo the White House statement last night strongly opposing the U.S. Rights Act amendment, and I urge all of my colleagues in the House to support S-139. And I yield the remainder of my time.
I rise today in support of S-139, the FISA Amendments Reauthorization Act. As a former United States attorney, I know firsthand the enormous value that programs like Section 702 provide in protecting our country. Numerous threats have been thwarted due to our intelligence and law enforcement communities having tools like Section 702. Chairman Goodlatte, along with the members of the Judiciary Committee, worked diligently on legislation to implement meaningful reforms while ensuring the law enforcement and intelligence committees still had the necessary tools available. This bill includes many of the reforms from the USA Liberty Act, enhances Section 702 protections, and maintains law enforcement's abilities. I would ask all members to join me in voting yes on this legislation to implement real reforms while ensuring that we still provide the tools necessary to keep American citizens safe. And in conclusion, as a U.S. attorney, I've used this, my office used this section. We followed the law to the letter. There were no complaints. And I want the American people to realize something. We in law enforcement throughout the U.S., we have to be right and on spot every second of every day. It only takes a terrorist a moment to get lucky and set off a bomb to kill Americans. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I rise in strong opposition to the FISA Amendments and Reauthorization Act of 2017, which reauthorizes Section 702 of FISA for 6 years without enacting adequate protections for our privacy. Supporters of this measure want to convince us a new, incredibly narrow warrant provision actually constitutes reform. It does not. Our right to privacy does not begin when the Department of Justice has a fully formed criminal case against us. Nor does it begin when prosecutors enter our emails and text messages into evidence against us in court. The Constitution guarantees far more than this. Our right to privacy protects us when the government first makes its decision to search our private communications for information it might find useful. S-139 falls well short of this basic guarantee. We therefore cannot, we must not support this bill. Make no mistake, S-139 is not a compromise. The Judiciary Committee, the technology companies, civil society, and other critical stakeholders were shut out of this conversation long ago. S-139 does not include a meaningful warrant requirement. The rule in this bill does not apply to most searches of the Section 702 database. It does not apply to a query for any information that, quote, could mitigate a threat, unquote, an exception that threatens to swallow the entire rule. And as a result, S-139 allows the FBI unfettered access to this information for purely domestic, non-terrorism cases without a warrant. And what does that mean in the era of Jeff Sessions and Donald Trump? It means that absolutely nothing stops the Department of Justice from trolling the database for evidence that you use marijuana, or fail to pay your taxes, or may be in the country unlawfully, or possess a firearm that you should not have. None of these cases have anything to do with the purposes of Section 702, and all of them should require a warrant based on individualized suspicion and probable cause. I agree with Chairman Goodlatte that Section 702 should be reauthorized. I understand its importance to the intelligence agencies, but neither of us should support this bill. None of us should support this bill, which pretends at reform while codifying some of the worst practices of the intelligence community in domestic crimes. When we came to Congress, each of us took an oath to defend and protect the Constitution of the United States. I ask that each of my colleagues honor that oath today, and that we work together to defeat this bill and to bring the right set of reforms to the floor without delay. I thank the Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I now recognize my good friend, the gentleman from Texas, Judge Poe, for a minute. And if he goes over a little bit, that's okay.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for a minute plus.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, I'm a former prosecutor, former judge. I despise terrorists. We ought to go after them and get them. 702 was written to go after terrorists, but it is being used to go after Americans. Normally, when I was a judge, I'd sign a warrant. Before the government could go into your house, they had to have a warrant to go into the house and to seize something based on probable cause. Under FISA, as it's used against Americans, forget the terrorists, used against Americans, government has already seized your house of communications, all of it. And they look around, and sometimes they go back to a secret judge in a secret court and get a secret warrant via a FISA judge, and they come in and seize something and prosecute based on irrelevant about terrorism. That's why this bill violates the Fourth Amendment. Get a warrant before you go into the house of communications and effects of papers of Americans, or stay out of that house. These documents have been seized, communications have been seized by government. They're kept forever. Keep government out. Without a warrant, you stay out, because government, as we learned from the British, cannot be trusted. Get a warrant. Stay out of the House of Communications. Vote against this bill. Let's redraft it and protect Americans. And that's just the way it is.
Gentleman from New York.
I now am pleased to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlelady from California.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, like the ranking member, I oppose this bill. It does not meet the standards that we should have for adhering to the Constitution. Now, this is a confusing debate in some ways, because people are, are we talking about? We're all against terrorism, and we've authorized the collection of data of terrorists communicating with each other. In 702, if they communicate with somebody here, we can collect that too. But because of the architecture of the Internet, we are collecting vast amounts. We can't go into the numbers here in open session. Vast amounts of data. It's not metadata, it's content. It's the content of your phone calls, content of your emails, content of your text messages, video messages, and under 702, you can search that for Americans for crimes that have nothing to do with terrorism. We should change that. As Judge Poe has said, you need a warrant to go after Americans for a non-terrorism crime. You know, there's a reason why a left-right coalition, the NAACP and FreedomWorks, Color of Change, and Gun Owners of America have come together on the same point of view. We should stand up for the privacy rights of Americans and reject this bill and have a warrant requirement for searching for the information of Americans that is in this vast database. And just one further point. The very weak predicate criminal investigation trigger for a warrant, which is at the end of the investigation, would apply only to the FBI. So if you are the ATF, you would never have to get a warrant. If you were the DEA, you would never have to get a warrant. This bill is inadequate, ought to be defeated, and I yield back.
Does the gentleman from Virginia seek to control the time of the gentleman from Pennsylvania?
I ask unanimous consent to do so.
Without objection. Gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Recognized.
As you all know, the Judiciary Committee worked diligently for a year on legislation that does two things. One, protect American civil liberty by requiring a court order to access Section 702 data during domestic criminal investigations, and two, reauthorize the 702 program, which is our nation's most indispensable national security tool. We achieved that by passing the USA Liberty Act in the House Judiciary Committee last year by an overwhelming bipartisan vote, which is no easy task. However, we were able to responsibly balance civil liberties with national security. The bill we will vote on today was drafted in the spirit of the USA Liberty Act. It is not perfect, and the process getting here was not ideal. But the bill requires, for the first time, a warrant to access 702 collected communications on U.S. persons in criminal investigations. Moreover, in routine criminal cases, when the FBI accesses U.S. person communications that were incidentally collected without first obtaining a warrant, the FBI will not be permitted to use those communications in a criminal prosecution. This will prevent a national security tool from advancing run-of-the-mill criminal prosecutions. These are meaningful reforms. The bill that was presented to us before Christmas with its optional warrant construct was not real reform. The bill we are debating today, however, contains meaningful reforms. I would have preferred to include additional reforms, but I cannot stress to my colleagues enough that our choice cannot be between a perfect reform bill and expiration of this program. The 702 program is far too important for that. With this bill, we can have meaningful reform and reauthorization. In its current form, this bill will pass the Senate. I also want to caution everyone that we cannot go too far in seeking to alter this program. There is an amendment that will be offered, sponsored by Mr. Amash and Ms. Lofgren, that would prevent the FBI from ever querying its 702 database using a U.S. person term. Imagine the FBI getting a tip from a flight instructor whose student acts suspiciously by expressing great interest in learning how to take off and fly a plane, but has no interest in learning how to land the plane. This could be innocent behavior, but we don't want law enforcement. We want law enforcement to at least be able to perform a search to see if they already have in their possession any communications between the student and a foreign actor involved in organizing terrorist plots. The Judiciary Committee passed bill would have allowed the search and allowed law enforcement to view the metadata without a warrant while requiring a warrant to view the content of the communications. The Amash-Lofgren amendment, which was rejected in the Judiciary Committee, goes too far and would prevent such a search from even being done. It would thus kill this critical program by preventing the FBI from even looking at its own databases without a warrant, rendering it ineffective in preventing terrorist attacks, and stifling its ability to gather necessary intelligence. It must not be adopted. I will vote to support this bill. I will oppose the Amash-Lofgren amendment, and I urge my colleagues to join me. Vote for reform and reauthorization. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, many of us are opposing this bill and supporting the amendment because it is very different from the Judiciary Committee bill that we reported, which was a good bill. I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mrs. Cicilline.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this bill. Supporters of this bill have called it reform. This is not reform. It's a massive expansion of the government's ability to pry into the private lives of innocent people. If you need proof, just look at the bill's section 702, which is supposed to authorize spying on foreign adversaries, but it has emboldened some in law enforcement to collect and read private communications of American citizens without a warrant. Instead of curbing these practices, S-139 would codify and expand some of the most abusive surveillance practices used in recent years, including about collection and backdoor searches. There is no more important responsibility that we have than keeping the American people safe. But we have to do it in a way that is consistent with our values and our Constitution. This bill undermines our values of privacy and freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. I urge my colleagues to oppose S-139 and to support the Amash Lofgren Amendment, which allows intelligence agencies to do their jobs without undermining our values as Americans. We can do both things, Mr. Speaker. Keep the American people safe and honor and respect our Constitution, which protects the privacy of all American citizens. I urge defeat of this bill and support of the amendment. And with that, I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Gentleman for Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, a member of the Judiciary Committee.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership in ensuring that a number of important reforms to Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Act were included in this legislation. I rise in support of this modified version of S-139. While this does not go as far as towards reform as the USA Liberty Act did, which was passed out of the Judiciary Committee in November, the reforms that are included help to provide a more adequate balance between protecting our civil liberties and providing the intelligence community an important national tool for another 6 years before its expiration this Friday. FISA Section 702 is a critical tool used by the intelligence community to protect American citizens from foreign threats and has been successfully used numerous times to prevent terrorist plots. Since we last reauthorized this, much has changed, not only in who our foreign threats are, but also in the methods that they use against us. The bottom line is we need to protect the safety of the American people. We need to make sure constitutional protections are in place, and this is a proper balance.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Let me repeat the refrain of those of us who are members of the Judiciary Committee who have gone through this process since 9/11, and that is that we support the integrity and the importance of 702 as a national security tool, and we want it reauthorized, but we want it right. But our job and our task is also the protectors of the Fourth Amendment, and that is the protection of the American people against unreasonable search and seizure. And no matter how much my friends on the other side of the aisle argue, we know that the FBI can have the tools that it needs. But in the instance of this underlying bill, similar to the bill that was passed in 2007 by the Bush administration, of which the Judiciary Committee came back and amended it and made it a bill that provides the tools that was needed by those who are on the front lines in the United States military and the FBI, but ultimately it was changed to deny those rights. In this instance, the warrant that my friends are talking about applies only to fully predicated cases. It does not apply to the searching of documents that will have information about Americans. I ask my colleagues to postpone this. Let us work together on behalf of the American people. And who are we if we cannot uphold the Constitution? It is not protected in this bill. I yield back.
Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin, a member of the Judiciary Committee and chairman of the Crime Subcommittee.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this bill, and I will speak later on some of the other parts. I want to talk about the stuff that is reauthorized in this bill after the NSA itself stopped doing it earlier last year. What about collection means is that, for example, if you have two jihadists that are in Pakistan and are communicating with each other, that they didn't like something that Mr. Nadler said against jihadists, the FBI can pick up the name Nadler and go into all of his emails, all of his texts, all of the information that they have on him, and be able to see what Mr. Nadler had said about jihadists, and much, much more. And that's why this bill opens the door to something that the NSA has closed itself. Now, we will hear from people who support about collection that Congress has got a chance to review it. They give us 30 days to do it. We can't get anything done in 30 days. Vote no on the bill.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 45 seconds to the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having served on active duty in the United States military, when it comes to foreign terrorists on foreign soil, we need to track them down and kill them. That's why I support the FISA Act as applied to foreigners. But unfortunately, this act has now been used to apply to Americans. And if you're going to do that, you need to follow the Constitution. You need to put in a warrant requirement. Unfortunately, the Nunes FISA bill does not do that. That's why I support the USA Rights Amendment. At the end of the day, this is not about terrorists or terrorism. It's about, can you use warrantless information against Americans in a domestic court? That's what this issue is about. Don't let the intelligence agencies scare you. Vote no on the Nunes bill, yes on the USA Rights Amendment. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time is remaining on each side?
The gentleman from Virginia has 2 minutes. The gentleman from New York has 2 1/4 minutes.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 45 seconds to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our times are this. The president is abusing his authority. He's stacking the courts with incompetent and ideological judges. He is usurping the powers of the Justice Department, the FBI. He's turning them into political animals. And at the time that he's doing this, we're considering this legislation, which leaves the door wide open for the abuse of Fourth Amendment rights of Americans. This is a bad bill for a particularly bad time. I'm asking my colleagues to vote no. We can do better than this. I'm asking my colleagues to vote in favor of the USA Rights Amendment, and if that amendment is not passed, then I ask my members to vote no on this overall bill. We can't afford to let this happen. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 1 minute to say in response to those who advocate for the Amash-Lofgren amendment that this amendment will very, very seriously damage our national security because 702, a program for which there is no evidence of abuse, used to gather information about non-United States citizens outside the United States in a targeted fashion. They have to go to the court and get approval for the selectors to gather information on a quarterly basis. They gather information. Incidental to that, sometimes there's information about United States citizens. But guess what? The information does not come with little labels attached saying this is a United States citizen communicating here, or the communication involves somebody in the United States. I will not yield. And therefore, it is absolutely vitally important that we not impair the most important intelligence, electronic intelligence gathering mechanism that the United States has to keep us safe and oppose the Amash Amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you. I now yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to this bill that does nothing to stop the unconstitutional collection of Americans' international communications without first obtaining a warrant, and codifies the practice of indiscriminately sweeping up massive amounts of domestic communications. What makes us different from those who would harm us is our commitment to our constitutional values, that we are innocent until proven guilty, that our government must obtain a warrant and show probable cause that there is a legitimate reason to listen in on our conversations. This bill will further expose people to warrantless prosecutions or detention and deportation in cases that have absolutely no connection whatsoever to national security. I hope we reject this bill unless we approve the Lofgren-Amash amendment.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have only one speaker remaining to close. I therefore reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished Democratic leader, Ms. Pelosi, California.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. How proud I am of the House of Representatives that we have come together on the floor of the House and in our various caucuses and conferences to discuss the important challenge that we all face, the balance that we have to protect the American people. That's the oath we take to protect and defend. And as we defend the Constitution, defend the privacy and the civil liberties of the American people. It's difficult. Many years ago, over 20, I went on to the Intelligence Committee for the purpose of protecting civil liberties and privacy. Also to stop the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, two really important overarching issues. And so I come to the floor today as one who has worked on this issue for a very long time. And I want to thank our men and women in the intelligence community for the work that they do. We're so proud of what they do. And in those days, when I went almost 25 years ago first on the committee, it was about force protection, to try to have enough intelligence to avoid conflict, but if we were to engage, that we would have the intelligence to protect our forces. It was about force protection. As in the 90s, it became more about fighting terrorism and other overarching issues as well. But we live in a dangerous world, and force protection on the ground in theater is still an essential part of what the intelligence community does. And again, I thank the men and women in the intelligence community for their patriotism and their courage. The issue that relates to fighting terrorism is one that sometimes has a frightening manifestation on our own soil. But as we protect and defend the American people and the Constitution and their rights, we have to have that balance. Was it Benjamin Franklin said, if we don't fight for private security and freedom, we won't have either. I want to particularly thank our ranking member on the Intelligence Committee. He has made us all proud going across the country, honoring our Constitution, talking about undermining our election system, talking about protecting the American people in ways that is consistent with our Constitution. I thank you, Mr. Schiff, and I support you today in your support of the bill that came from your committee. Is it perfect? I've never voted for a perfect bill in this House. I also want to thank Mr. Nadler, a genius on all of these issues that relate to our Constitution, and the members of the Judiciary Committee. On intelligence, we have a very few members who are deputized by the Speaker and by the leader, each party, to go to the Intelligence Committee to deal with issues that relate to the balance between security and privacy. And with all the respect in the world for the magnificent members of the Judiciary Committee, all of whom I respect, it's not right to say there is nothing in this bill that protects the privacy of the American people. In fact, when I was supporting the Judiciary Committee bill, the outside groups were complaining. They wanted this Lofgren amendment. They didn't want that bill. They were complaining about it. Now today they're saying that's what they want. Well, I think that studying the issue, one of the differences along the way is when it is appropriate in terms of a warrant. That's why I'm so pleased that we'll be offering a motion to recommit that addresses just that concern, which is what I'm hearing from folks about. The amendment, the motion to recommit, addresses concerns of people on both sides of the aisle, certainly in our Democratic caucus, which seeks to secure the highest possible protections for American civil liberties. At the same time, it ensures that the intelligence community and law enforcement can continue to keep Americans safe. This amendment would go a step further from the modified bill that's on the floor under consideration to ensure law enforcement secures a warrant before assessing Americans' information, accessing Americans' information. Let me repeat that. The amendment would go a step further than the modified bill under consideration to ensure law enforcement secures a warrant before accessing Americans' information. Under this amendment, the court order would be required to access Americans' data in connection with any non-national security criminal investigation by the FBI. This amendment removes predicate, that's the operational word, removes predicate standards and expands the universe of investigations that would require a warrant. A vote for this amendment, and I hope it would be bipartisan, especially from those who are objecting to the bill that's on the floor, is a vote for privacy protections and for civil liberties. We would have preferred to have this in the original bill that's coming to the floor. Couldn't get that in committee. Hopefully we can get it on the floor. Voting against the motion to recommit as a vote means fewer protections, less oversight, and more risk that Americans' rights will be violated. In the course of this, I mentioned this issue about the warrant and the rest. And I want to take the opportunity to commend the Speaker for ridding. I talked about the Judiciary Bill. At the offset of all of this, the first intelligence bill, we all opposed. Supported the Judiciary bipartisan bill that was there, being criticized by some outside groups for supporting that rather than the Lofgren Amendment. But changes were made in the intelligence bill to this effect. We asked the Speaker to take out the masking provisions, which have no place in this bill. The chairman of the the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Mr. Nunes, foolishly put that in this bill. It made it a complete non-starter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for removing it. And by the way, somebody should tell the President because he thinks it's still in the bill. With that being said, I personally directed to fix the unmasking process. It isn't fixed in the bill, Mr. President. That would be a second tweet of the day, confusing matters even worse, unfortunately, because the administration, although they probably would like an extension of the status quo, understands we have to do more than that. The other provision that was in the bill was an expansion of agents of foreign governments. Agents of foreign governments opened up more people who would be subjected to surveillance. We said that doesn't fly. That has to be closed. The Speaker did that. And then on the about language, I think most people who understand that issue, or it's a complicated issue, understand that it's really not a factor in this discussion. People don't want it mentioned, but the fact is that it had to be addressed, and it is not being used, and it's unconstitutional, and until it can be proven to be constitutional, it can't be used, and when it is used, it have to go to the FISA court to get permission, and then come to Congress for ratification of that. So there are many protections there. So it's hard, I know, it's hard. I had a hard time when I was Speaker and we passed a bill to address the gross violations of Dick Cheney, of the Vice President Cheney doing the Bush-Cheney surveillance. It was appalling in my view. I considered it unconstitutional. Others did not. But nonetheless, we put in many, many protections where there were none, and then renewed and improved them when we renewed the bill subsequently in its reauthorization. So this isn't about the other side of the aisle saying, you don't care about privacy if you support this bill. It isn't about that. It's about where you strike the balance, when you weigh the equities. And we have to come down in favor of honoring our Constitution and our civil liberties, but we cannot do that completely at the expense. And I believe that the members of the Mr. Nadler understands that full well, and I commend him for his deep understanding of the vital national security issues and the invaluable work that your committee has done to strike a balance between security and privacy and has made a difference. But the choice we have today is to pass something that is not, defeat this bill. Okay, you've done that if you want to do that. Pass an amendment that won't go anyplace. You can do that. And we will be left with an extension of the status quo, of the current law. Being one who was participated in writing it those years ago, I understand its merit. I also understand the changes in technology, of tactics, of the terrorists who are out there, and that we have to improve the bill. I don't consider it a reform bill. It's not that vast. It's some improvements in how we can collect, protect, again, and keep the American people safe as well as protect their civil liberties. Just a couple other things about it. Since this is legislation was designed to address concerns related to the use of information collected under FISA, Section 702, an important foreign intelligence collection authority. We have to keep that emphasis on an important foreign intelligence authority. So my colleagues, to that end, this modified law requires a court order based on probable cause for FBI criminal investigators to view Americans' communication in the Section CO2 database and mandates an Inspector General study of 702 data. So let's keep the vigilance on, even as we go forward. It contains refined language related to abouts collection, requires the executive branch to secure explicit approval from the FISA court for collection. It further objects to abouts collections to subjects a 30-day congressional review process. I know Mr. Sensenbrenner said nobody can do anything in 30 days, but I think we can. And the bill strengthens the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. That is something I was instrumental in establishing when I was on the Intelligence Committee. I know its importance, but I also know that it has to be strengthened and it has to be respected as a watchdog. So, I mean, the list goes on, requiring public reporting on the use of 702 data, just saying to the intelligence community, don't try to minimize any violations that may have occurred. We want the facts, we want the truth. And that's why I'm so glad it has expanded whistleblower protections and briefings to the oversight committees, which we have required. Unlike the original House Intelligence Bill, which I opposed, this bill does not include language that would have likely expanded the universe of FISA targets who are now, as I mentioned before, agents of foreign policy powers, excludes the language on unmasking. Somebody tell the president. And it gives me great pride in our caucus. If you could have heard the beautiful debate between Mr. Nadler and Mr. Schiff on this subject. We're not that far apart. I think that the motion to recommit addresses most of the concerns we have been getting from the outside groups and the communities that are dedicated, whose organized purpose is to protect the civil liberties of the American people. But again, with great respect for everyone's opinions and whatever they have put forth, again, saluting our men and women in the intelligence community for the work that they do. We want to be sure we strengthen their hand in terms of protecting the national security of our country, which is our first responsibility, to keep the American people safe. And as we do so, to honor our oath of office to the Constitution, to honor the principles of the Constitution. Our founders knew full well the challenge between security and civil liberties. They lived in a world when they were under attack. The War of 1812 came very soon after the establishment of our country. So this was not a foreign idea to them, and they bequeathed to us the responsibility to protect, defend, protect our liberties. And again, respectful of this debate on this issue, I myself will be voting to support my ranking member on the Intelligence Committee, Mr. Schiff, our ranking member, and members will follow their conscience on this. I just wanted you to know, from my experience in all of this and weighing the equities involved, that that's the path that I will take. With that, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, has all time expired on the other side?
It has.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, to close for our side of the debate, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, a member of the Judiciary Committee.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and I also thank the Minority Leader for her remarks in support of the 702, and I rise in support of the 702 reauthorization. It is critical to our national security. You would see the color drain out of the faces of all of our security personnel, the entire national security community, if we lost the ability and went dark on 702. We've got to follow through in this Congress. We've got to provide the flexibility for them to use the tools that we have available to us. And we set up procedures that will approve this annually under the FISA courts. We've got a probable cause requirement for any criminal investigation that protects U.S. persons. And we don't need to be protecting anything but U.S. persons when it comes to this. The gentlelady spoke of civil liberties, and I stand in defense of those civil liberties as well, and in defense of the national security. We've got an IG report. It's written into this bill. But I would remind the people that are concerned about this focus on these civil liberties that Google and Facebook and Verizon and AT&T, they hold more data than the U.S. government has. That's where the real information is, and if they're concerned about that, they should raise that issue. Meanwhile, I'm going to oppose the Mosh Amendment and support the reauthorization of 702. Our people in this America, U.S. persons, deserve that protection for national security reasons. I urge its adoption. Yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields.